Now I am very excited to welcome you to the Writer Center's virtual craft chat series, where we talk with writers a little less about what they wrote and a little more about how they wrote it. My name is Emily Holland, and I'm thrilled to have former Poet Lore guest editor Taylor Byas joining us as tonight's guest in celebration of her poetry collection, I Done Clicked My Heels 3 times. And I will say it's not only a bestseller, it's also award winning. So we're celebrating all the things. Taylor, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I'm so excited.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And thank you to everyone who is here and already chiming in the chat. I'm really excited to talk about craft.
Yeah. So maybe to start us off, could you read a couple of poems for us tonight?
Absolutely. Um, it's kind of customary, but I want to start with the first poem of the book, which is also the first sonnet of the Southside Crown that is broken up throughout the book. So this is Southside number 1. This is what teaches me love. Your streets, they're wailing for the dead. The way a siren becomes a mother too. How my parents hold me like some frail thing to their chests at night. How quick they are to cover my ears when the block gets hot. The handshake, half hug, sacred enough to make a man feel whole again. The shape shifting, how what looks like a thug in darkness softens into a boy in the gold glow of a bedside lamp. How we are all somebody's grandbaby. Harold's chicken steeped in so much hot sauce the nose runs, and the small piece of bread too wet to hold, drowning beneath the fries, each of our brownstones side by side, so there's nowhere to run, nowhere for us to cry. Um, and then I'm going to read 2 more. This is The First House. There are no gardens for our brownstones, only the square bite of courtyard out back. 3 other buildings sidling up like dinner guests. Only split sidewalk fringing a tuft of dead grass. Enough space for little Tyke's tricycles and the rats' monthly meetings. Even the walls, half pint, forever child size, my bedroom ceiling yawing downward like the underside of a playground slide or seesaw. Our kitchens stacked like Legos. What we want has so little room to grow. Still, some things creep through the cracks, the weeds in the small backyard, those thick, pill-bodied roaches and their choreographed promenades on the other side of the walls, their eventual spawning in the wool of my house shoes. And the limp-wristed wrangling of gunfire out front, bullets like punctuation, beginning and ending more than sound, until a stray pricks our front window, anchors down in the stuffing of my father's favorite recliner. Days later, I would dig into the hole, not to recover the bullet, but to feel an open wound, to know what it means to cheat death. And then the last poem I will start with is called On Hesitation. I wished I'd let you drive as the sky closed the lid on things. The headlights on the other side of the highway blurred to orbs as fuzzy as dandelions, my sight failing in the dark. But I was in a groove, wasn't ready to stop again before we crossed the next state line. So when you spotted a barn, a black stamp licked and pressed against the midnight blue, I stopped you before you even began. We don't have time for adventures. But this pattern continued, you straightening at each site of wood rot, at every front barn door cracked open like a knife wound. Soon I tired of the cornfields, their sameness, the vanity with which they continued to spawn the self. So I indulged you, abandoned the highway smooth to spit gravel in the wake of your Jeep. When we pulled up to this barn, you dated its abandonment, At least 10, 15 years because of the smile of the roof, the wind breezing through the barn's gut, its catcall whistle, and both sets of doors blown open. Your pulse two-step during our silent watching, and I thought you were turned on by this somehow, and my God, you were. Let's go in, find some hay, like in the movies. And what of the pessimist in me, betting on the rustic charm of disarray as a trap, some chainsaw-wielding killer eyeing us from the Cyclops window? Even you could go rogue, one bite of me giving way to another, then another. But you've gotten out of the car now. Come around and open my door. We'll laugh about this from years from now. Your hand in the dark, not how I always remember it.
Ooh, thank you. Thank you for reading those. I think there's so much to talk about in those poems that you chose. So I'm glad that I can, formulate some questions around those too. And just a reminder to folks who are maybe joining, we are doing a giveaway for some copies of Taylor's books. So post the word giveaway and the name of one of your favorite poets in the chat. This is partially selfish for me to find some new poets to look at, and there's some really great recommendations here. So wonderful. All right, Taylor, could you tell us who you are in your own words?
Oh, wow. I think first and foremost, I am a poet, but I write, I think, in all genres, a little less than I would like to, but I started as a fiction writer. And then kind of at the end of my undergraduate years, I sort of switched over to poetry, and now here I am. Earlier this year in April, I just finished my Ph.D. in creative writing at the University of Cincinnati. I am now serving as an assistant features editor for the Rumpus. I am also on the editorial board for Beloit Poetry Journal, and I'm an acquisitions editor for Variant Literature as well, working specifically with chapbooks right now. And here I am now with a book out in the world for 2 months now. And it's been such a strange thing for this thing to kind of be out of my hands in some ways. And also because of the sort of timeline of publishing, this is a book that has been done for like 2 years maybe now. And to now be back in these poems, which I feel like I have kind of evolved away from in a way, which is not a bad thing, but it's still so strange a little to be back in this book so intensely, to now be writing other projects actively. So it's been really interesting, but it's been also very sweet to spend some time with like my younger poetic self, who I think was just really finding a love for form in this book, which I think kind of comes across, hopefully, just how much fun I was having in this book. So it's been a lot of fun.
Great. Yeah, it doesn't sound like you're busy at all. Like not a lot going on at
Oh,
all there, right? No, that's wonderful. And I know that you also have another book sort of in the works and on the horizon. So that's really great to hear. And yeah, super excited to dive into this. And since it's so new, I think maybe this is a good space to open up with our sometimes what folks consider a more difficult question, which is what's something that you haven't been asked about your work that you've been wanting to talk about, or something that you maybe do within your work or that you notice going back to your work that readers haven't brought to your attention?
um, so what kind of first comes to mind, and this comes to mind because someone has just recently brought this to my attention, and I haven't heard this comment in a very long time. Um, Someone said to me the other day, like, you're such a horror writer. Like,
Mm.
there's so much horror in your writing. And this isn't necessarily a book that I consider to be a horror book. But at a reading yesterday, I was thinking about like, oh, it's October, it's kind of end of the month. I wonder if there are any poems that have kind of a spooky vibe, and that's part of the reason why I read On Hesitation, because I came
Mm.
across that poem again and I was like, oh, this is straight out of a horror film. Um, so going back to my work, I've been thinking a lot about how horror kind of shows up and
Mm.
why there's an undercurrent of horror in my work, even in places where I'm not necessarily um, being forward about that. And I think there's something about one, a lot of my work is very, very narrative. As I mentioned, I was a fiction writer first. And so I think the impulse to tell a full story
Mm.
in a poem kind of stays with me. But I think there's something about the narrative and maybe the pacing of that in which like certain things unfold in my poems that I think lends itself to a kind of cinematic horror sometimes,
Mm.
which I think is really fascinating. The poems that I'm sort of writing now in this moment, I'm seeing that a lot more. And so it's been really interesting to go back to this book and kind of look a little bit more closely to think about what poems are the horror kind of peeking through.
Mm.
So yeah, thinking about horror and how it's showing up in my work, maybe in places where I haven't thought about it as intensely.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I'm also thinking about, the poem in here. My therapist asks, "What are you afraid of?" And so that idea, that element of fear, that's kind of joining with horror too. And um, I think it's always interesting to look back on our work because there's a way that we're sort of always reaching towards our next work, even if we don't know it. And then in that act of looking back, it's like, oh, I was already sort of thinking about these things, and now they're coming out in new ways. That's wonderful.
Yeah,
Great. Definitely a good season to be thinking about it too.
for
Um,
sure.
so I know I sent a lot of questions about form, and I really want to talk about form because it's something that's so exciting. I mean, I love the sonnet as a form, and I love the way that you're sort of in reinventing it, contemporizing it, and having fun with it too. But I'm realizing that when I sent you the questions, one of the main things that I was thinking about while I was reading and rereading was the element of place. And I think I was thinking about it so much that I didn't actually write a question for you about place. So I wondered if we could start there, and if you could talk about the impact of place specifically as almost a formal consideration for the book itself, and how you evoke a place that feels authentic without playing into maybe reader expectations of what that place is.
Yeah, place has, I think, consistently been crucial consideration in my work because I think place, geographical place, has this really kind of inescapable influence over, the way that I experience everyday life as a Black woman. And so, um, and I was thinking about Chicago, there was already all of these kind of preconceived notions and stereotypes of Chicago that I think I was coming up against or having to write against in the book. And I think part of moving past that or part of doing that work of writing against those stereotypes was casting Chicago as not a sort of static place, but as a character. I think Chicago becomes a character throughout the book. One of my favorite poems, which I mentioned, the sonnet, the South Side Sonnet
Mm.
Crown, which gets broken up throughout the book, but in its kind of original state with all the sonnets together, we see these kind of vignettes, these different aspects of Chicago, in the same way that I think we could like characterize a person, right? All these
Mm.
different ways that we can see a thing, to sort of cast it as this complicated thing. And so I think presenting it as a complicated character in the book was at the foundation of how I wanted to talk about it and how I wanted to bust the stereotypes of Chicago, as Margaret has said in the chat. Um, and I think pieces like the Sonic Crown, which are very connected,
Mm.
but allow us to kind of like, I'm thinking of like a Rubik's cube in your hand, just kind of being able to kind of turn it around and look at the different sides of it, but still
Mm.
being all a part of the same thing. So city as character is kind of how I approach that for sure.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think it was really interesting to sort of keep revisiting it and seeing those different sides, seeing those different facets of the space, while thinking through the impact of that place on the speaker and that journey as well that we're sort of kind of traveling through in the book too. Great. Okay. I wanted to make sure that we at least talked about place a little bit. Okay, so let's go back and maybe before we get really into form, I'd love to talk about the role of music within your poetry, not just sort of the music that we can listen to, right? There's the Beyonce inspired acrostic piece. There's some music references in here. There's, of course, the structural element of the whiz as sort of a backdrop. But then there's so much musicality to your lines. So could you just talk about your personal relationship to music as a poet? And then maybe talk about when you decided to sort of incorporate the whiz as a structural element to kind of move us through the book.
Yeah. So my relationship to music and form, I think, are very intertwined and inseparable. Part of how I came to form in my master's program, very shortly after I decided to switch over to poetry, I went through what I affectionately like to call my formal boot camp introduction. And me and my mentor, essentially, I think it was maybe like an 8 week like individual study. And essentially every week I was introduced to a new form. It was like, here's the form, here's the constraints. You have 1 week to write a poem in this form, and you can't break any of the rules. And I'm going to give you these additional restrictions on top of that, which would be like, you have to use these words, or you have to use a word of that has like 5 syllables in it. When you're thinking about sonnets and working a word that has 5 syllables in it, you're like, what are we going to do? But that introduction, although I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to anyone who doesn't like a little bit of torture, I think it did force me in those early phases, and before anyone really talked to me about it, to find possibility and to create possibility within form. Because I was kind of just thrown to the wolves, I had to kind of dig my way out and fight my way out by creating possibility. And that early experience really shaped, I think, my relationship with form that I still have. And even my introduction to iambic pentameter, we were in a classroom and quite literally scanning out on the board certain lines. My professor would give me a line of how he wanted the stresses to go, and I had to kind of come up with a line on the spot that matched the stresses. And so I think those early lessons taught me just how to hear the music, how to hear meter, and I cannot unhear it. I think even in my readings, for example, On Hesitation is a prose poem. There's no sort of formal constraints, but I think even in the way that I read it, sometimes you can hear the cadence of the music, like it never kind of escapes me. So I think that early introduction to both form and meter really just laid a foundation of thinking about sound, thinking about meters, beats, breath all the time, and I just can't unhear it at this point. But when we think about the music of the whiz, and this book went through, a few versions. And when I first gave it to my agent, it was not the book that it is today at all. It had 3 sections. It had a whole lot of poems that are not even in here anymore. We organized it together, and then when we sold it to Soft Skull, I got with my editor, and my editor, we reorganized it again. And then in thinking about the whiz, the music in the whiz very much serves as kind of like chapters. I see them as these chapters that have marking these different parts of the journey. And we were like, well, why don't we just try to see if the songs can kind of overlay on these sections and can kind of guide the reader through in this way. And we can lay them over the narrative arc that we're trying to create. And that ended up working out perfectly for us. So it kind of came later, that organizing structure, but thinking about music as, helping a narrative, right? Helping to build a narrative trajectory, and being able to do that in the book. I'm really happy we did, because the book wouldn't have been what it is without it. So.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think of that coming later on because as a reader, we encounter that almost first, right, when we're looking through the table of contents. And
Mhm.
then we're almost like, okay, like now I know to pay attention, like music is going to be a big concern here. And this is going to be coming up in the poems in lots of different ways. And I think that it's so useful as a structural element, but also as kind of an extended narrative element too. You mentioned that a lot of your poems are sort of in that narrative form. And I think that even the sections are doing some of that legwork to move that narrative too, which is really great. What else? Blah, blah, blah. Oh, I did have a question too about maybe specific lines and how your revision process works when it comes to music. So, how does your focus maybe shift between that like early drafting phase for constructing the line and then that reattention to it and revising? Does a lot of that kind of musicality come through in revision, or is it there sort of as you're composing the line themselves?
Yeah, when it comes to music, I intentionally kind of overwrite my early drafts with probably way more music and sound than I need, and I cut back.
Mm.
Um, and I think I cut back in a lot of ways because I think it's easier for me to kind of overwrite and vomit in the first draft and then and whittle away in the same way that I think a sculptor does. I've been comparing poems and sculptures a lot lately.
Mm.
There's something there, but I definitely will overwrite the sound, and I think a lot about environment. I'm thinking about what sounds are in this environment. For example, I've been working on a poem about rain. I've been thinking about, okay, what sounds, at least to me, do rain make? I'm thinking like
Mm.
hissing sounds, like a lot of rain kind of makes this perpetual hiss sound. Sometimes it makes like a pitter patter sound. And then when I kind of figure out, okay, what sound does it make in the real world? And I'm like, okay, how does that sound translate in language? What letters or what letter combinations make
Mm.
this sound or represent this sound for me, right? So the hiss sound, I'm probably gonna like go crazy with S's, or that pitter patter sound, I might, throw a lot of P's in there and I kind of overdo it.
Mm.
And then I go back in the revision process and I kind of say, okay, where have I where have I gone a little overboard? What of this do I maybe not need? And then I can kind of maintain the original idea, the thoughts, the environment that I was trying to create, but then kind of figure out what places are the crucial places that I need to keep. And so for me,
Mm.
it's thinking about the sound, the environment, how it translates into letters or letter combinations, going overboard with those in the early drafts, and then kind of reeling it in throughout the revision process.
Mm. Love that. Love the sort of extension of the sounds away from just those descriptions too. I think that that can really heighten the experience of the poem, especially when, if you read them aloud when you're reading or if we can hear them out loud too. It's lovely. All right. I know there's a lot of questions in the chat, and we will get to some of these. I'm really excited. But I wanted to talk about form, specifically maybe the sonnet, and then we can dive into the chat because I think there's some formal questions in the chat too. So just on the outset, um, I think you're one of the poets that immediately comes to mind for me when I think of the contemporary sonnet. I just love these configurations. I love the attention to the rhyme and the use of the kind of structural elements we get. And here we get like the sonnet crown, we get single sonnets, we get the duplex. We also, in some moments I was like, oh, there's kind of a sonnet inside this other poem that's going on here. So what attracts you to the form, which is small, right? Rita Dove calls it a little world. It can hold so many things. So what do you see as maybe the possibilities of the sonnet form?
Yeah. I see Morgan has actually put in the chat, would you mind reading one of your sonnets? So can
Oh
I
yeah.
actually find a sonnet to read and then
Yeah.
hear this? Um, I'm going to read, and just so y'all know, I really just, speaking of going overboard, there are three seven seven sonnet crowns in this book. on top of additional sonnets outside of those series. So I definitely could not help myself. Um, I'm going to read How Young Boys Survived the Ghetto 101, which is one of the earliest sonnets I think that I ever written. I think I wrote this probably in my master's. So, like, about maybe 6 years ago now. 6 years ago now. So, How Young Boys Survived the Ghetto 101 after Ghetto Boy Chicago, Illinois, a photograph by Gordon Parks, 1953. Playhouse. Climb on a chair of shit-stained paisley in an alley. Avoid the broken bottles. Cut your mama's house dress. Make a cape that's maybe a size too big. Pose for this camera. Strut like the pimps that limp these streets in zoot suits, caned in gold tooth. Know the power of a stuck-out hip, its demand for respect. Practice your slang and call the women shorties until you luck out, get slapped upside the head. Don't turn around. Don't look behind and see the world's kept going. That El Dorado drooping down to the ground, its rims still spinning, pool hall lights still glowing. Boy, look into this lens. Let me remember you like this, carefree, acting a fool like you always do.
Mm.
Um, so the sonnet for me, I always talk about this Michael Frazier in a virtual event we did, another wonderful poet. He has this incredible Venn diagram poem. And I remember someone in the audience asking him about the form. And he said, form sometimes feels like we come to the page with so much to say, oftentimes. And a lot of times form is this really neat container in which I can throw all of it and I can sort through and figure out what it is that I'm trying to say, like what's at the heart of what I'm trying to get at. I think the sonnet, because of how small it is, I think more than anything forces me to be as concise as any other form requires. And not only that, I think there's this really interesting opportunity to play with language in the sonnet that I don't get with other forms, to kind of find like those slant rhymes, those words that are not exact rhymes, but are like right there close enough to where you still hear the music. And so I get this opportunity to like play with words and with language and sound in a way that I think other forms just kind of don't allow me to. And then there's also the fun of surprising the reader with all those internal rhymes that are like not expected as well. And so I think for me the sonnet is probably the form that forces me to be the most concise with my language. It forces me to be the most concise with what I want to say in general. I find that the revision process for sonnets as a result are probably the hardest for me, which is also interesting. But the language play that I get to do in the sonnet is probably the most fun out of any of the other forms that I write in. So the difficulty in revision kind of balances out based on the amount of fun that I get to have in sort of writing it in the process. But there's something about it. There's something about playing with those inlines. There's something about the like rush of pleasure you get when you like enjam that inline and when you read it out loud, it's like not noticeable. It feels natural. There's something so satisfying about like puzzling it together in that.
Yeah, could you talk about your approach to the sonnet crown, those linked sonnets? As I was reading the Southside poems, I was like, this line is familiar. And then I was like, it's a crown. It's just expanded throughout the whole book. And then you have those two other crowns. And I was like, okay, this is like very masterful. And there's, a long line of poets engaging with the sonnet crown in different ways too. So could you talk about maybe your approach to those linked sonnets and how they present their own sort of extended possibility or transformation across the work?
Yeah, those sonnet crowns to me feel like different rooms in a house, kind of that are connected and that the reader then gets to walk through. Um, Writing them is a journey, because you have to think so intentionally about your first and your last lines, of course, because they're the sort of doors between each poem. Um, but I think with that and with a lot of forms that repeat, whether that's a pantoum, whether that's a villanelle, um, it also presents the question of like what I like to call texture. Um, and for me, that's like, how are we changing the texture of these repeating lines to transform them? Is that punctuation? Is that bringing in some like italics? Is that parentheses? Is that making this dialogue? Um, there are these really fun considerations of texture that kind of come into play, and that I think force me to think about language differently and push me out of my comfort zone. So there is something about working on those connections between the sonnets that brings me a lot of joy, in the same way that, you know, the repeating lines in pantoums bring me a lot of joy. But I think also thinking about the sonnet crown, like I'm thinking about someone like Patricia Smith, who was the queen, one of the queens of sonnets, in my opinion, and just the kind of effortless storytelling. And again, I'm someone who's very narrative driven, and so I think naturally I'm also driven to sonnet crowns, because the sort of space to tell a story is so expansive, probably more expansive than any other form. You have the sestina, which is a really long girl, and she gives a lot of space as well. But you know, nowhere near as much as a sonnet crown. And I think also thinking about a long story, you have these manageable kind of vignettes that you're working on too. And so I think it also helps me to situate how I want to tell that story, how I want to lead a reader through in a way that feels more organized than maybe another form, or maybe like free verse or something else.
Yeah, I love that storytelling element because now that you mentioned it, so many of the sonnet crowns, not just in your book, but that are being written by others, do sort of really engage with that narrative momentum between those pieces. And I think that's really poignant to think of the phrase you use, the door between the sonnets, those lines that repeat. I think that's really interesting, and how our perspective can shift between them, or how maybe the narrative can shift between them too. Wonderful. Right, I'm going to dive into the chat. Early on, Nebraska Poetry Society asked, what are some of your favorite forms to write in? And so we've thrown out a lot of different form names here. You've also have villanelles, pantoums, sestinas in this book too. So maybe pick a favorite. Is it hard?
Not at all. The pantoum is my absolute favorite, hands down.
Ooh.
Um, there's something about a pantoum that I just can't shake. Pantoums are my absolute favorite. I think one that's growing on me, I've always liked it, but I think I'm liking it more as time is passing, is the duplex form, created by Jericho Brown. That one has been really fascinating to me as of late, and has been, I think, presenting some really interesting opportunities for me in the sort of current things that I'm writing. So that one's kind of climbing up the ladder for me right now, but has not yet displaced the pantoum in its number one spot.
No, I love that. It's interesting because the duplex also has that repetition that's sort of connected to the pantoum, but then of course the duplex is also connected to the sonnet, so it's doing some other things there. Yeah, lots of fun. The energy of a pantoum is sort of hard
Yeah.
to escape once you're in it.
Yeah. In conclusion, I like formal torture. I think that's what we're coming to.
See, I know. I think, I do think though that a lot of times, especially I see it with my students, I teach undergrad students, and anytime I'm trying to introduce forms, they're like, ugh, they just see like, why are there rules? There shouldn't be rules to my poetry. But there's so much possibility in these forms. And I think, especially in your poems here in this collection, there's some fun behind them. There's some really fun sort of puzzling happening. There's transformations, and then of course you're bringing these forms into kind of like the language of the everyday, in really surprising ways too.
One thing I've said recently about form and writing in form is that I think it requires mischief. Like
Mhm.
I think writing in form requires a certain degree of mischief. And maybe that's why it's so fun. Maybe that's why I'm having like the time of my life when writing in form. But I think there is something about it that requires like a little bit of mischief. And yeah, I don't know, thinking about students in particular, and sort of their introductions to form and the fear of like, oh, I don't like rules and writing in these constraints feel terrifying and limiting. I think also another way to kind of frame it is, especially in those early stages, I think it's so hard to step outside of the comfort zone when you're in those beginning stages. You have kind of like you're just figuring out your voice, you're just figuring out your style. And it feels really scary to move away from it because you've just kind of got a hold of it. And I think form provides this really fun space where you get like pushed out of that. You have to think about language in a different way. You have to incorporate some language and some words that you maybe wouldn't automatically reach for in your comfort
Mhm.
zone because meter is now forcing you to come up with this synonym for this thing that you want to say, but that has different stress. There are all these ways that I think form can be a really great and productive tool for those early writers to step outside and get pushed out of their comfort zones as well
Mhm.
too.
Yeah, yeah, and also that element of attention, like the attention to every word, that sort of um, maybe close reading of your own text that can be terrifying in its own way too. Yeah.
It does require attention. Yeah. Oof.
That's the fun part though. That's why we do it, right?
Absolutely.
So PK Robbins in the chat had a question about how would you define poetry as opposed to other forms of creative writing? And I'm also thinking too, maybe to open this question up a little bit, um, how has your approach shifted from maybe your fiction writing? I know you also write kind of criticism, reviews, nonfiction, and then also poetry too.
Yeah. I think poetry is so special because one, I see poetry as kind of like this magical bridge between fiction and nonfiction. One of the things that attracted me, I think, about poetry was the way that I came to it. I was writing fiction and then I took an ekphrastic poetry class.
Mm.
And, each week we were either going to the art museum and looking at art, or we were given art to then respond to. And part of those responses was just like, create a story, right? Like create a story for either what's happening in this art, or create a story about a person interacting with this art in the museum. Like there was an element of fiction, I think, that was there that was really
Mm.
attractive to me. And then of course on the other side that we have nonfiction, we have the speaker as like this version of the self. I always think about that wonderful Spider-Man meme where they're just all pointing at each other. And I just imagine that being like me and the speaker of the poem, like we're just doing that all the time. Um, but there's a way that of course I think poetry is very much, inspired by real life and inspired by the things that we go through, memory, always coming through. But there's a permission, right, to fictionalize and to strange what's happening that doesn't exist, right, in the realm of nonfiction, for example. And so I think poetry has the power to kind of grab from both
Mm.
sides in this really, really exciting way. And then I'm also just thinking about what poetry affords me. Poetry allows me, and I think this has become more true in the things that I'm writing now, but I think it allows me to like redefine what truths I thought I knew.
Mm.
Um, there's a writing exercise that I love to do and that I've been doing a lot of lately where I write a scene that is very much like inspired by something that I've actually gone through. Write a scene of something, a difficult moment, whether that's a difficult conversation, a moment of tension, between myself and someone else. And in the first iteration, I just write the scene with all the details, all the feelings, thoughts that I'm having. And then in the second version, I rewrite it and I try to write it from the perspective of the other person. And I try to think about how they might have experienced this moment, how they might have felt misunderstood, what could have gone wrong for them. And then in the third and final version, I write it from a like third person detached perspective. And I give myself the permission to like make all of these guesses and to suspect, to kind of like make the thing strange with this like knowledge that I've done, or this knowledge that I've kind of worked through in the two previous versions. And really interesting things come out of that. And I always find that my understanding of the original thing or the event has like shifted in the process of like doing this exercise. And I think poetry for me has that ability to shift my understanding of truths that I've held on to, because I have the room to write things that are close to myself, but then I can make them strange. I can, write in persona. I can do all of these different things. And so I think it's this really magical blend of both worlds that allow me to redefine and rethink about truth.
Yeah, no, that I think this is so interesting because there's, that we're always talking about like the truth outside of the poem and then that emotional truth that's really within the poem that sort of allows us to have that flexibility of we don't have to document exactly what happened as long as we're kind of capturing that emotional truth. And I love that idea of making it strange, introducing something new, something different, reconfiguring how we are even thinking about something too. Yeah, lots of folks in the chat taking notes from that prompt that you just offered up. So I think that's wonderful.
Yeah, please use it. And also PK, I see your follow-up. I don't think one needs form like a pantome or sonnet to define one's writing as poetry. No, I don't think that's true. I think there are a multitude of forms that fall under that. Yes.
Great. This is so great. So many questions. Let me go back into the chat. Margaret had a question about your work as an editor and sort of the different ways that maybe that is affecting your own writing or your idea of what a poem can do or be. So how has that had an impact on your own process in any way?
Yeah, being an editor and reading a lot of submissions, and it's interesting because I read poetry, but then I also like get to read nonfiction for the Rumpus as well, which is really fun. And I come across a lot of things that are bending genre and a lot of lyric pieces, for example. So I'm always coming across other people's things, which I think just constantly reminds me of just the expansiveness, like the endless possibilities. One thing that I think is really nice about being an editor is the constant reminder that there is no right or wrong way to write a thing. And if there are, plenty of writers in this room, I'm sure that we've all experienced some of those days or moments where we come to the page and what we encounter is the kind of fear of getting it wrong, right? There's like a fear that like I have this thing to say that feels really important, and yet I'm afraid of the failure that is maybe waiting for us, right? In that draft. And I think oftentimes there feels like a particular way that we have to do something or a particular way that we feel called to write a story or write a thing. And being an editor, I'm just constantly reminded of the just like the endless range of what could be done. So that's one thing. And more than anything, I think being an editor encourages me to be more just attentive to everything that I do. I don't know if anyone else is an editor in this room, but it's one thing to sit with our work, right? It's one thing to sit with something that we've been working on for how long, and to try to find the sort of things in our writing that maybe aren't working. And it's another thing to encounter a lot of work, a high volume of work sometimes, and to then have these like really interesting conversations with your other editors. For example, for Beloit, we actually will like take a weekend to talk about a lot of our submissions together.
Mm.
And what comes out of those conversations is always really interesting because sometimes the difference between being accepted and not being accepted is something so small, right? It's something so little that like changes the entirety of the piece, or that just completely shifts the trajectory. And I think about those moments a lot, and I think about like the smallness of those things, but how they make such a big difference. And so I think when I return to my own work, I'm so locked in on everything that's happening. And I think with poetry in particular, there's already so little room, much less room than fiction writers and nonfiction writers. And I think all the choices that you make in poems are so much more important, right? The punctuation that you use is more important. That choice between an em dash and a comma, for example, those things matter and have more weight than they probably would in a prose piece. And so I find myself really combing over the details of my poems. I think more intensely after being an editor, because I've been on the other side now, and I know that sometimes the small things are the things that we're like debating over and talking about when it comes to making those final decisions as well, because there are so many submissions and there are only so many that you can take. And so I think I've just now become like so much more mindful of those small things in my own work.
Yeah, no, I think that that's really true in the sense of attention that it takes to be on both sides of editing, and then also still trying to curate your own work in some way. I find, if I'm reading submissions and sort of evaluating submissions, then I need to give myself a couple days before I go back to my own work, because there's just so many voices in my head. I'm like, is this my brain? Is this something I recently read? Is this something that I recently accepted? Like what's happening? But there's really that level of attention that is sort of cross-pollinating between your own work and the work that you're engaging with on the level of submissions too. That's lovely. Great. Let me pop back into the chat and see. I did have a question, since you mentioned that you're working with kind of chapbook acquisitions, and I know that you had 2 chapbooks before this debut collection. Could you talk about the way you approach chapbooks and the way you approach this collection? Was anything similar? Were they kind of different? Probably the concepts and the concerns of the books themselves are quite different, but I'm wondering just in terms of kind of method and compiling poems, how those approaches maybe changed or shifted.
Yeah, I think because of the difference in length being kind of the main thing, I didn't think about a larger narrative arc as much for my chapbooks. I think those were more about here are these poems that feel very deeply connected. They seem to be all speaking to one theme, right? The chapbooks are typically more focused projects, whereas I think full lengths have the capacity and the space to kind of hold multiple things that are talking to one another. And so with my chapbooks, it was like very focused. This is the theme, and then I just kind of felt like, oh, these poems are connected, so these might go together. It was more of that process, instead of thinking about how do we organize this project and how do we tell a story throughout the book. And I didn't have a lot of outside editing for the chapbooks as well. So a lot of the onus was on me to organize and to make sure things were in the right place. And so in that sense, there was a little more pressure for those to get things right and to make sure that I was satisfied with them. Whereas with the full length, I knew I would have an editor. I knew I would have someone else kind of working with me, someone outside that could look at the poems and see things that I didn't. So the chapbooks, I think, definitely helped me to begin to think about how poems speak to one another, to think about the different ways that they can speak to one another, whether that's sound, whether that's they have these two themes or these images and these poems that are talking to one another. So maybe these should go together. I began to start to think about how to put together a book with those projects because so much of it was my own work. And then I kind of had all these lessons and things in mind when it came to the full length. And then I had extra help, which was just also great. But
Mm-hmm.
they gave me, I think, the space to start to think about what it is that I'm doing to be more mindful of. We're not just throwing a whole bunch of poems in a Word document and saying, "Hey, this is a book," which is definitely what was done at one point, and definitely what this book was at one point was like, I think these poems go together, and just kind of throwing them in one document. But I had to have some outside people very very lovingly be like, no, this is this is not the book yet, for me to reconfigure and to come back to the drawing board and figure that out a few times. And so there's also a way that the full length, uh, that I had to deal with some no's and some failure, and I don't mean failure in like the terrible scary sense of the word, but
Mm.
there is a way that I have to learn how to set my ego aside, for people to tell me, no, this is not it yet. Let's rethink about this again because it is so dear and it feels so personal and close. And it's hard when you think you've got it and someone comes along and is like, no, not quite. But it was necessary for the full length for sure in a way that it wasn't for the chapbooks.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for expanding on that process too, because I think it's really interesting. It can be sort of a, I don't want to say solitary because we're always sort of writing in community, but that chapbook project can be so different from the full length project, and we all do at some point need someone to be like, this isn't quite, it's not quite doing what it needs to be doing, and it can feel, these are all, this is like pieces of me, right? These are all my poems.
Yeah.
But that's what gets us better as well.
Mhm.
I did just want to before we kind of get to our last question here, our giveaway winners are announced in the chat. Thank you, Amy, for using our random generator to generate those winners. So Yasmin N, Kirstine Fleming, and Bergies and Hausern. Please contact me. I'm putting my email in the chat with your mailing address, and we will get those books to you. We're happy to be able to send you a copy of Taylor's book so you
Yeah.
can spend so much time with it. Great. And thank you everyone for all of your entries and for the poet recommendations too. Those are my favorite thing. All right. To maybe take us home and kind of end on some different notes here. I wondered if you had any advice to writers who are maybe working on their first collection or doing, the work of a poet and looking for some way to get involved with a writing community. Something that I love about you and your work is all the different things that you're tapped into and all the different things that you do for the community, whether it's, hosting a poem a day in April with a formal constraint every day, workshops, different things. So if you had any advice for maybe finding community or finding your people in some way that can help kind of make that writing process a little less lonely at times.
Yeah. Um, I think one, like finding your people, part of it is just like finding the people whose work that you are enjoying. If you're tapped into magazines, publications, whether that's in print or online, and when you come across someone's work that really speaks to you, or someone's work where you're like, oh, this person is writing about, things that are important to me. I feel like my work is in conversation with this person. I encourage you to reach out to those people. I cannot tell you how many of my poetry friends and people who are now like first readers of a lot of my work that I met when I just kind of encountered their work in a literary publication, and I was just like, hey, I'm kind of obsessed with this poem of yours and this issue, and a sort of like poetic friendship was born. So I would encourage you to connect with the people whose work you encounter and whose work speaks to you. Don't be afraid to find those free or like low cost spaces, whether those are readings, whether those are workshops. I know sometimes it can feel like nerve-wracking, especially if you're in a weird phase in your writing, or maybe you're like feeling very protective of your work, or maybe just feeling nervous about being in a space and sharing with other people. But it is so, I think, life-changing to be in spaces with other writers, to be vulnerable in that way, to be in workshops where other people are being really considerate and generous in reading your work. I think it's vulnerable for you, and it's also vulnerable for other writers who are also bringing their experiences and their perspectives to your work, and sort of are able to kind of hold a mirror up to you in your work. Those things have been very life-changing for my work, and I think it helped me evolve and only sharpen my own sense of like what's working and what isn't. Like I think having those soundboards in your community are necessary because it helps you to sharpen and develop your own sense of what you feel strongly about in your writing. Like if you workshop a poem and someone gives you feedback and you find yourself having a strong reaction to it, that means something. That means you feel strongly about something that's happening in your poem, whether it's like you want to defend this thing or whatever the case may be. That's you developing your own sense of what feels good to you, what your style is, right? What's important. And so I think those spaces are necessary for developing and sharpening that as well. Writing the first book, I feel very fortunate that a lot of the writing that happened for me was in like programs, my master's and my PhD, and I know that that's not the case for everyone. But part of why this book happened is because I think I learned how to listen to what the poems were telling me, and I stopped trying to control the poems. Which we all love to do. We all love to think that we like know what's happening and know where the poem is going. And the poem just humbles me every single time. But I think following your instincts, writing towards what feels urgent, I think naturally things take shape when you kind of do that, and when you just take the time to listen to yourself and listen to the work. Because I think that's the way that our minds work. Like we're always turning over things, things are marinating right in our minds. We have all these concerns. We have books forming as we're out living lives and as we're out reading and as we're being in community. And I think just showing up to the page when the page calls you is sometimes all you need.
Amazing. I think that's the perfect place to end, though I'm so sad that we can't just sit here for, I don't know, 5 more hours and talk about everything. Thank you, Taylor, for your generosity with your answers, for your work. Once again, please, everyone, pick up a copy of I Done Clicked My Heels 3 Times. It is amazing. You're going to want to read all of these sonnets and other poems in here that we talked about. Taylor, thank you again for all of your time and your work. It's always a pleasure working with you in different ways. So I'm so happy to have been able to do this conversation with you.
Oh, of course. Thank you. Thank you for having me, for your questions, for everyone here, and you all's questions in the chat. It means the world to me to get to talk about poems. So thank you all.